These sonnets were first conceived as songs, and indeed, in the case of the one that's called number 47, there's already another version of it as a song in a completely different key and with a completely different melody, which Liszt began but then abandoned. And these three sonnets are all, apart from being some of the most marvelous poetry in Italian history, they inspired Liszt to come up with some of his very best melodic ideas. And when he arranged the pieces for the piano, he managed to incorporate all of the spirit of the poem, and at the same time, he made the transcription much freer in some respects, as far as reorganizing the melodic shape. So, for example, this song, the vocal part is which works perfectly with the voice, but with the piano, it's not going to be so pretty. So he changes it into just 6 notes to the bar. And then for the final stroke of genius, moves it by half a beat away from where the accompaniment is. So the left hand proceeds and that turns out to be one of his happiest inspirations. Just a couple of things about numbers. The numbers that are on these sonnets are not the ones that you will find in any modern edition of Petrarch's poetry. But we have to be patient. I have actually seen the edition that Liszt knew, which had a complete... all of Petrarch's poetry is published together under the title of Canzoniere, and these pieces have moved around over various editions of the work. But so 47, 104, and 123 are as Liszt found them. Fortunately, the poetry is the same, so it's not to worry too much about it, but it's strange that we keep these numbers as if they're somehow important. Whereas what's really important is to know what the poems are all about. So it's also good to know that when he first conceived these three as a set for piano, he put 104, that's to say the second one, he put that first and composed a completely new introduction, which is very dark and brooding, and then had 47 and then 123, which is indeed the order of them when they were songs and first printed. But when he put them into the second book of the Année, he took that introduction off, put the pieces in a different order, and actually retains the introduction of 104 to be just like it is in the song. So this first one, it's very easy to find a translation of the poem, but Benedetto sia il giorno, il mese e l'anno is blessed be the day, the month, the year, the season, the time, the hour, and the moment, and the beautiful country, and the spot where I first clapped eyes on those two beautiful eyes which have bound me to them. And it's one of the many love poems which Petrarch is writing to his beloved Laura, and who he sometimes refers to by her name, sometimes just refers to as Donna, and when he does, he usually writes a capital D on that, so it's my lady. And his passions for her are very variable, but actually in the end very constant. So this first one, because you've just finished the canzonetta in A major, it's really rather splendid how this joins on to the previous one, because you've finished and with that exact chord, and add a stroke by the cunning use of the German augmented sixth, you get from A major to D flat major like that. And it's not the first time in his life he engineered a modulation that was so clever, but he does it a lot. And all you have to do with this piece is to keep the meter under control, so that if things get too recitando and too much full of cadenza, then we lose the track of the musical argument. And if you lose the musical argument, I maintain that you also lose the poetic argument, because after all, the sonnet is a very strict poetic form, and Liszt's response to it is exactly in the right measure of formal adherence to the sonnet structure, and also puts in absolutely every bit of passion that you could possibly want, and even goes up with the same thing that he does with the vocal line, and writes what is like a vocal cadenza, and he writes it for the left hand, which is very good, because it means that you're going to hit the first note of it with the whole weight of your hand, which is with your thumb. Just a small remark about the arpeggio on the last chord. It's very wearying occasionally to hear young players, because they've heard some old pianist doing it on some ancient record or something, and they play something like, which is really not a very happy solution, because it stops the melodic line from being comprehensible. So for my money, you should start, if you want to play the arpeggio a little slower, then start it earlier. Otherwise, I think that's enough arpeggio. It becomes even more problematic at the end of the next piece, the Sonetto 104, because you have got a melodic line at the end which you must preserve. And if you mess around with that and play, it might sound quite nice, but it makes the rhythm completely incomprehensible. So I recommend not to do it. At the beginning of this Sonetto 104, we have, as I said before, these in the left hand. Now, if you can play them, that's very good, and very good luck to you. If you can't actually get your hands around them, then it is important to come up with a solution. If your hands are really tiny, then you must even consider changing the text, and it would be much better to hear with the left hand played in thirds than it would be to hear what one often hears, which is where the rhythm is completely not brought out at all, because the most important thing is to hear exactly where it is on the beat. So if you have to arpeggiate them, do it very quickly and play the bottom note exactly together with the right hand. So this adagio bar is the top of the crescendo, so the people who suddenly go are missing the point completely. The sonnet begins with the words pace non trovo. I cannot find peace, and this is what this rhythm is. And then this sonnet is completely composed of paradoxes. The first one is, I don't find peace, but I don't have it in me to make war. I hope, and I fear, and I'm ardent, and I'm like ice. I fly above the earth, and I'm confined to it. I don't want to hang on to anything, but I embrace the whole world. I'm in a prison that neither opens nor shuts, and so on. It's all like this, and you find out exactly what it's all about. I'm full of sorrow, and whilst crying, I laugh. I am equally unpleased with death and life, and in this state, woman, I am on your account. And it's a marvelous poem, and you must have this poem in your mind the entire way through. One of the things that goes wrong in this piece in performance is that people forget what the poem is, and when they get to the end, where Liszt's last dynamic direction is forte, which is way back more than 10 bars before the end. So we're still forte here. It's sufficient to remember the end of the poem. This is the state that you have me in, and which means all of a dither. So it's not a sweet little reflective coda with everything disappearing away into silence. It's much more powerful than that. The actual text of the music, there are several things that one ought to watch out for just because they're not there by accident. For example, in the opening of the melody of the song, the arpeggios the first time are two of them, one in each hand, and the ideal performance direction I would offer for that is that you should start them together and end them together. And doesn't matter how many notes there are, just so long as you start and finish together. And then make a complete contrast with the second phrase, which is going to be even more ardent than the first one, where his arpeggio, instead of being divided between the two hands, goes all the way from the bottom to the top. So it's always look at Liszt scores. I never tire of saying this, but in exactly the same spirit that you would look at the score of a Beethoven sonata. So make sure that you know that Liszt has gone to some trouble with the way he actually marks his scores up, because he gives you all of the instructions that you need if you would just be kind enough to observe them. There is one spot in this. Oh no, there's one more little note. That is how it was in the first printing of this piece, but he altered it in somebody's copy to read. So C sharp rather than an E. So some editions still print an E, but the Budapest edition prints a C sharp. But it's interesting to know that for some reason Liszt changed his mind, because the whole bar, E is the top note, and it represents also the note that's sung in the vocal version. But I think he maybe thought that he'd stressed the E too many times. A little bit further on from there, we have a bar which you either play or it's very plain when Liszt writes an austere text that it's a little bit as if it's one for the men and one for the boys. And I think you can take it as read that the more difficult reading is almost certainly the one he played himself. We have some knowledge of various places in his texts where there is a choice of two, and we know which one he played. Importantly, in Valet d'Obermann, in the first book of the Année de Pèlerinage, we know he played the very different austere passage there. And what's more, when he arranged that piece for piano trio, that's the version of the text he used. But that's just a little aside. It doesn't really matter if you don't play the austere text, but I think it's a very interesting thing to try. The third Petrarch sonnet is really, it's a very lovely poem, and the essence of it is, I beheld on earth the custom of the behavior of angels, referring, of course, again to Laura, and elevating her to angelic status. And the music for it is really very simple. It's one of Liszt's most straightforward melodic ideas, and it must, I believe, be played absolutely strictly in time. If you start to mess around with too much tempo rubato in this work, it pays you back in not a very nice way. So even though there's a little room for something in the way of anxiety at the beginning, not at the very beginning, but because that's and you just keep it neat and tidy. But this passage, you can use a little bit of freedom of tempo. in order to give his espressivo and then his crescendo and then his appassionato, then his rinforzando, all due attention. But then we have the tune proper, and this is where we have to play it with, I believe, Mozartian simplicity. It's also important because frequently in performance one hears this rhythm played like this, which is completely wrong. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So don't play that as a triplet. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. And we should observe these rhythmic niceties absolutely accurately. Otherwise, this piece is relatively straightforward, apart from that you need to study and use his fingering to make sure you don't get anything in the way of a wrong note, because if you do, you're stuck with it for the whole chord all the way to the top, and that's a pity to spoil. It's the only difficult bar in the piece, so it's worth paying it some mind. At the very end of the piece, there is, I think, a slip of the pen. If you compare this with the song and with the earlier version for piano, the second last chord does not have this low C in it. It's written the left hand. And if you have all of these last chords, but in the first edition it's written which doesn't just double the major third, it trebles it, because you've got, and it doesn't really make any sense to do it. So I believe that the addition of that extra note is intrusive, unnecessary, and almost certainly incorrect.